Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein, and we've got the whole crew here, Patricia Murphy and Tia Mitchell, because today is finally primary day in Georgia, and by tonight, we're going to know a lot more about who voters want leading both parties into one of the most consequential and unpredictable election cycles this state has seen in years. On the ballot, races for governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, U.S. Senate, Congress, the Georgia Supreme Court, and every seat in the state legislature. But remember, in Georgia, being the top vote getter isn't always enough. Candidates have to clear 50% to avoid a runoff. That means tonight probably won't settle the biggest races. It could simply launch another 4 weeks of political chaos. So instead of trying to cover every contest on the ballot, because that would take probably the rest of the day, we're focusing on the races that could tell us the most about where Georgia politics is headed next. And guys, let's start with Patricia's column about the Republican race for Georgia governor. Can you buy a Georgia election? Rick Jackson with $83 million plus in spending already. He's trying to test that experiment out, Patricia.
Well, $85 million will absolutely take you from 0 to 34, 35-ish. Will it take you over 50%? We don't know, but I have never seen a candidate come from absolutely out of nowhere to essentially leading in polls, although somewhat deadlocked with Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, purely based on the amount of money he spent, the unbelievable amount of money he spent against Burt Jones also to drive up his negatives. Rick Jackson also has a really incredible personal story, but nobody would have known that had he not spent all that money to tell people about it. Mailers, sometimes 2-3 a day at this point for many Georgians. He'll send out what looks like an entire newspaper about Rick Jackson. You can unfold it. It's a broadsheet. It's unbelievable. So money can definitely buy you a spot at the top. Can you win? I don't know, but Rick Jackson's really going to make a go of it.
Yeah, and his candidacy just really upended Burt Jones's trajectory because Tia, with Donald Trump's endorsement way back in August, going against Brad Raffensperger and Chris Carr, two prominent Republicans, but definitely not favorites of the MAGA base, Burt Jones looked like he was going to waltz into, if not the nomination, into a runoff where he was the heavy favorite. And now, if things, we'll see how tonight goes, but if the polls are accurate, if the campaign analysts are accurate, showing a runoff between Rick Jackson and Burt Jones, it's going to be an entirely new, expensive, chaotic election cycle.
Yeah, I think one thing we need to remember is that Rick Jackson was a latecomer. We thought the field was set. And then first became these mysterious ads attacking Burt Jones. Then Rick Jackson launched his campaign. So even the Trump endorsement precedes Rick Jackson as a candidate. But I think it kind of flies in the face of conventional wisdom that a Trump endorsement alone can kind of clear the field for a Republican candidate. Now, again, Trump did not rescind his endorsement, but it precedes the conversation involving Rick Jackson. So to me, that makes the race and the potential outcome even more interesting, because if it goes to a runoff, what does President Trump do?
Yeah, and Trump has doubled down on his endorsement of Burt Jones. He had that tele-rally with him just a few days ago. But interestingly enough, Patricia, he's also not saying anything negative about Rick Jackson. He's not going after him like you've seen him in other races around the nation, and frankly in Georgia too, where he's taking shots at Brian Kemp directly in 2022, over and over and over again, saying that if he wasn't involved, he'd rather have Stacey Abrams even as governor, right? Which is kind of the ultimate Republican insult in Georgia.
Yeah, and I think also you can't forget the fact that Rick Jackson gave Donald Trump $1 million before he got into this race, right before he got into this race. There's no faster way to Donald Trump's heart and happiness than to stroke him a check for $1 million. I mean, that's another one of the strategic choices that Rick Jackson's made in this case that have ended up being, I think, very fruitful. It's so interesting also, and I'm sure you know this, Greg, from going to Rick Jackson's events. He has an appeal to voters that reminds me a lot of Donald Trump from 2015. It is really almost stunning to watch people's emotional reaction to Rick Jackson, because he has this incredible personal story from being a foster child to raise himself up to become a multi-billionaire. He also does not speak in talking points. He has no political experience. And so he has that like outsider billionaire, I don't give two craps about politicians, I'm here for you. Like that is what Donald Trump told people in 2015. That's what Rick Jackson's telling people now. And he also compliments Donald Trump quite a bit. So he's not a never-Trumper. He's not an anti-Trumper. Well, he's been accused of being a never-Trumper, we have to say. But he is very complimentary of the president. But there is an appeal to Rick Jackson, and there are crowds for Rick Jackson that I think show that there was a huge open lane in this GOP primary that he saw and decided to take advantage of. I think also he has a personal grievance toward Burt Jones. Not a grievance, but I think he was not impressed by Burt Jones' campaign that he was running up to this point, up to January. And he's like, look, I'm getting in this race. There's an open lane. I don't want Keisha Lance Bottoms to be the next governor. I'm getting in.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say if Burt Jones had like 40-50% of the vote in the polls, there'd be no way for Rick Jackson to make a mark in this race. But of course, he was in the 20s in the polls and had been seen as sort of this weak front runner. Patricia, me and you both, I think combined, have gone to a dozen or so of these events with Rick Jackson. And there's this line in his stump speech where he talks about putting a line in his wealth, right? Like he's worth $3 billion, we know from. But he said at some point a few years ago, he just kind of drew a line and he said, everything above this line is God's money. He's going to give it away. He's going to spend it on charities, or maybe perhaps he counts running for office and spending it on his candidacy as part of that. But you can see him connect with the crowd when he does that. You can definitely see him, I look around the audience of that line and just see all these people, moved by that part. So that just shows you his personal appeal. Let's talk about the Democratic race for governor too, because we've got Keisha Lance Bottoms, the front runner from the get-go. Stacey Abrams decides not to run. Jason Carter decides not to run. Lucian McBath decides not to run. So leaves her as the front runner. But we're going to find out soon if that means she can get an outright victory, or we're going to see which of the three main rivals she's facing who end up as the alternative, because Michael Thurmond, Jeff Duncan, Jason Estevez, all of them are trying to be that alternative.
Yeah, I think that Keisha Lance Bottoms in her name recognition just is doing so much heavy lifting for her in this primary, just by the fact that she was the former mayor of Atlanta. I think a lot of the Black voters in the Democratic Party identify with her, her, quite frankly, her origin story as someone born and raised in Atlanta, a mayor by the name of Keisha, almost became like a tagline. And so I think that stuck with people. There are some, as we've been talking about and we've been hearing, there are some Atlanta residents who feel like Keisha Lance Bottoms has somewhat whitewashed her tenure as mayor and smoothed over some of the rough parts. And they worry about her becoming governor, quite frankly, and are supporting other candidates. But I don't know if that's really translated to other parts of the state where she's been able to connect with voters who aren't as familiar with her tenure as mayor. And she's been the front runner all along. That high name recognition, I think that her ties to President Joe Biden, who, especially older voters still think of somewhat fondly, or at least believe that he's a much better president than what Donald Trump has been. I think that has also helped her. But in a runoff, which, could she get above 50%? Perhaps, because there are so many undecided voters. But if there's a runoff, there's going to be a big contrast campaign that is underway.
Yeah, there's something clarifying on a runoff, Patricia, where you have, whoever the opponent is, if it does get to runoff, it's Jason Estevez, Duncan, or Thurmond, who will be taking more direct shots at her record. Right now, only really Estevez has kind of done that, right? Michael Thurmond definitely hasn't. And Jeff Duncan, I think he feels like if he does take shots at a record, it just exposes him to more shots about his past as a Republican. And of course, whoever the alternative is, becomes fair game, even more fair game too. And so I expect this sort of above the fray mentality from the former mayor to end, and she'll go right after her opponent as well.
Yeah, I think that when a very well-known candidate is held under 50%, it can be a sign of real trouble. We've seen that in Georgia over and over again. Somebody comes in leading out of the primary, but then loses in a runoff. And that's because there's an appetite for something else, something besides what's at the top of the ticket. And I think that Bottoms, if she doesn't get out of this runoff, and even if she does get out of a runoff and it's just facing Republicans are already attacking her. They're already going after her as if she's the nominee because they want her to be the nominee. They see her as the easiest to run against, the highest negatives, the highest potential negatives as well. So I think she's ending the era of kid gloves, frankly. I think she'll have a lot of attacks coming against her. And some of those will be, I think, well-founded. I think it's been very well documented how much the city of Atlanta struggled during her tenure. It was during COVID. There was a lot going on. It was hard for many, many big city mayors. She was one of the few who decided not to run for re-election for a second term. And I think that's what particularly some of her rivals also want to exploit. And so I think there will be a lot that Bottoms will have to kind of dig in and deal with after Tuesday, no matter who she's running against. But the fact that she does have such a high name ID, the fact that, frankly, she connects so well with the Democratic base when she's out at these events, she is delightful. People love her. She's so nice. She connects with them. They know her father and they know her background and her story. And she talks about growing up in Atlanta and being a fifth generation Georgian. So she has a very emotional appeal to lots and lots of voters. That's going to really, I think, run into not a brick wall, but she's going to have to really sharpen her campaign as well as she comes into this next phase.
Yeah, her father being Major Lance, the Soul Star, who I learned a lot about reading her memoir a few days ago. That came out a few weeks ago. Tia, let's go over to the Republican Senate race because this is the one where Governor Brian Kemp put his political legacy on the line here, drafting essentially an unknown contender, at least a political unknown, in Derek Dooley, the former football coach, but the famous last name, the Dooley family's a trademark in Georgia, but someone who admittedly was so not uninvolved in politics, they didn't vote in many elections before 2020. Now he's looking to be the Republican nominee against two congressmen, Mike Collins, Buddy Carter. Governor Kemp is on the campaign trail basically every day the last month, essentially stumping for Derek Dooley, and you can see the crowds growing. You can see the sense of momentum. You see him moving up in the polls. We'll see, but right now it looks like Mike Collins could be facing Derek Dooley, although Buddy Carter's got a lot to say about that.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting how much political capital Governor Kemp has invested in this race. You rarely see Derek Dooley on the campaign trail without Governor Kemp and, quite frankly, First Lady Kemp by his side. And on one hand, you get it because Derek Dooley didn't have much of a name or a reputation to draw crowds alone, so he needed the Kemp star power. Brian Kemp, again, has endorsed him, has tried his best to get people on board with Derek Dooley. I think that is going to be an interesting contrast should Derek Dooley make it to the runoff, because I think you can expect whether it's Mike Collins or Buddy Carter to say, you can't bring Governor Kemp to the Senate with you. When are you going to stand on your own 2 feet and be your own man in this campaign? And I do think being a political blank slate as well is going to be interesting for him. It also goes back to the Rick Jackson thing. On one hand, you don't have a record for people to attack the way Representative Collins or Representative Carter or even Senator Ossoff have. But on the other hand, it gives people pause to say, well, what do you really stand for? Because you were not just that you haven't held office before, but Derek Dooley wasn't even voting. He was a very, a political ghost, so to speak.
Yeah, and Mike Collins and Buddy Cutter both running to be like the MAGA loyalist. Of course, Derek Dooley not saying anything bad about the president too, saying he'd be his big supporter, but running from that different lane. Patricia, I want to talk too about one of the races that is actually not going to go to overtime. And we know that because it's going to end today on Tuesday. And that are those races for judicial seats, namely the two Georgia Supreme Court justice races. Charlie Bethel and Sarah Warren are facing really heated competition from, I almost said Democratic challengers, but challengers Jen Jordan and Miracle Rankin, who Jen Jordan certainly was a former Democratic state lawmaker, but this is a nonpartisan race, but you wouldn't know it because the party has gone all in for both these challengers, kind of viewing this as the last line of defense against Republican policies.
Well, I think this is a kind of a spillover effect from the U.S. Supreme Court, people seeing the way the U.S. Supreme Court has come down in a lot of high-profile decisions that feel partisan. Donald Trump calls the judges he appointed my judges. I want them to do what I want them to do, or they didn't do what they said they were going to do. So it feels like the judicial branch has become so politicized nationwide, it almost felt inevitable that this would happen at the state level because so many of these large national decisions have been sent down to the state level, particularly abortion. I think that's what a lot of this is about. I'll be really interested to see also how Jen Jordan and Miracle Rankin do in relation to each other. They've run as basically a double ticket, as sort of like a double chance for voters to sweep two incumbent judges out of office. Jen Jordan, though, has run statewide before. She finished higher than Stacey Abrams in her own race for Attorney General when Stacey Abrams was running for governor. And so it feels like Jordan has a little bit of a boost on all of the judges. She's just better known in many cases also. So I think that, but this is going to be, I think, a real test of whether voters even still have the concept and the belief that this should be a nonpartisan position, or if everybody's voting. The governor is holding fundraisers for the two incumbent judges. He appointed both of the incumbent judges, and there are two Democrats running against them. It doesn't feel nonpartisan in any way, but it is the way it's written, particularly even in the Judicial Code of Conduct. There are a lot of restrictions about what you are and are not allowed to say. There's a question of whether or not that line has been crossed in this race and past races. So it definitely feels like these races are going to determine kind of the nature of these kinds of elections in the future as well. But as you said, there's no runoff in these races. Whoever wins on Tuesday is who wins on Tuesday.
There's so many other races to tackle. We've got the down ticket contest. We've got U.S. House races, 5 open seats, including the seat held by the late Congressman David Scott. You can find all of our coverage at ajc.com. There you can also find our 2026 voter guide. It's for information on where all the candidates stand, the front runners, the long shots, you name it, where all they stand on key issues, and provide essential voting information for you as you head to the polls. Patricia, Tia, we have a hugely busy day and night ahead of us. 3 of us are going to get back together after the polls close and record a special edition of Politically Georgia. They'll be in your podcast feed first thing Wednesday morning. When we come back, what Georgia's turnout numbers could signal nationally and why both parties are watching this state so closely again. NBC Chief Data Analyst Steve Kornacki joins me after the break. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. If you've got a question you'd like to ask us here on the podcast, you can call our hotline anytime, day or night. Leave a question and we'll play it back and answer it right here on the show during our Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. You can also email us at politicallygeorgia@ajc.com. We got a record number of those calls last week, and we expect even more this week. Okay. Steve Kornacki is one of the nation's most recognizable election analysts, known for breaking down vote totals, turnout shifts, demographic trends in real time for NBC News. And today, as Georgia voters head to the polls, this state is once again at the center of the national map. Steve Kornacki, we're honored he's joining us right now. Hey, Steve.
Greg, it's great to be with you. Thank you for that introduction.
Yeah, we put out the red carpet for you, Steve. No, this is so cool because all of our listeners, all of our readers, they're going to go in depth today and hear what we're watching going into primary night in Georgia. And what's the very first number or county or trend you'll be watching tonight as the results start coming in?
You know, I've always, one thing I'm going to look at, this is not the maybe the marquee race, although I'm interested in it nationally, is the Supreme Court races here, the nonpartisan Supreme Court races, just to sort of see how that goes. And, you know, Fayette County has sort of been the one in that metro area that's been teetering, I think, of going from red to blue. The long-term trend is very favorable to Democrats. And so to me, that's sort of one of those bellwethers where if that's a Democratic win, a strong Democratic aligned win, I think that could be a pretty good, if the results come early from there, a pretty good bellwether about where that's going.
It's such an interesting race because it is nonpartisan, as you said. And there'll be some voters who skip it altogether because it's the very bottom of the ballot. And there'll be some voters who are, go in knowing exactly how they feel about it. But there's so much ad spending. I was watching the Braves game just the other night, and I saw my daughter's like, "Your name's in there," because they cited one of my tweets or something, one of the ads. But there's been a blitz of not Rick Jackson-esque blitz, but still like probably one of the most expensive judicial races we've ever had with millions of ad spending. So people know these races in Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, look, you guys are getting a little taste of up in Wisconsin. They do this, every spring, and they're officially nonpartisan races. And it's been interesting to watch them over the last decade or so become very partisan, very national, huge spending. And it looks like that's now something you guys are going to start living down there in Georgia. The thing we've seen in those Wisconsin races, and I think this is part of the story of Trump's second term, and what I'm curious is to see if that's what happens in Georgia, is the Democrats have had the turnout edge for those races. Now, in a place like Wisconsin, it's a standalone election. It's an extremely low turnout historically, and that Democratic base, part of that Democratic base has been just, especially in the Trump era, so jazzed to get out there and vote in any and every election. So the Democratic aligned candidates have been running up really like landslides in Wisconsin. I'm curious to see what the turnout is here. You have the added variable of competitive statewide primaries on both sides that could sort of dull that advantage. But I'm curious if there is an advantage there with Democrats to some degree.
Yeah, those judicial races will be decided tonight, but they're the only races because a bunch of other races, those statewide primaries, not only will they not be decided tonight, they'll be decided in November, but also we won't know the nominees for some of those races tonight either because they'll go to runoffs. So as you're watching these returns, what are the early warning signs that will tell you a race probably is not ending tonight?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I think that's certainly the expectation. In the one that I'm curious if it could somehow get to avoid the runoff would be the Democratic gubernatorial primary. Bottoms has that pretty substantial lead in the polling, but for one of them, she's really more kind of in the high 30s. So I think a long way to 50% for her. But yeah, I mean, look, what is she getting right there out of Fulton County, out of that sort of immediate Atlanta metro area? DeKalb as well. One of her opponents is from DeKalb. But is she getting numbers there? And also take a look at some of the smaller counties with high black populations. What kind of turnout is there, and what kind of numbers is she running up? Is there any chance she could get to 50%? Otherwise, then just the race for second is on, and it's an interesting one to start handicapping if it does get to a runoff, because I go from saying, was there any world where Bottoms could get 50% in the primary? If she doesn't, and if she ends up in a runoff, even if there's a lot of distance between her and second place, I'm wondering if that runoff could get a little interesting, because I know I'm curious what you think of it, but certainly I've been picking up on some buzz down there about concerns about electability, and if that starts to become a big issue, and it changes the dynamic, and once the one-on-one race.
Yeah, right
runoff.
now we know Michael Thurmond, the former DeKalb CEO, former state senator Jason Estevez, and former lieutenant governor, former Republican lieutenant governor Jeff Duncan, they're all like neck and neck in the AJC poll and most other polls we've seen. No clear alternative has emerged before the primary, but yeah, you could have a clear alternative emerge, come tonight, come tomorrow morning, come the rest of the week, where that electability argument becomes more of the framework, because right now we've seen very little back and forth from those those Democratic contenders. Jason Estevez has hit Mayor Bottoms a few times, but it hasn't been sustained attacks over and over again. But that could change in a runoff. And you mentioned DeKalb County. That's the biggest Democratic stronghold in Georgia, right up there with Clayton and Fulton. And that is also Michael Thurman's base, and he's won countywide there several times. So, I'll be watching DeKalb along with everyone else to see, just how Mayor Bottoms and Jason Estevez and Jeff Duncan are faring there, because if they fare poorly and Thurman just runs away with it in DeKalb, then that's a different ballgame too.
Yeah, no, it's a long way. It's hard for me to see you're getting 50, but the runoff could get. I think it could get very interesting because you have that dynamic of Ossoff. I think nationally we look at Ossoff in the Senate race, and right now I think nationally folks are looking at him as, if anything, slight, and I say slight, favorite in the general election. And if Democrats are looking at that opportunity, that possibility, and then they're concerned, if those concerns are real about Bottoms there, it makes them, it heightens their worry about the Senate race. And I think it heightens the sense of, let's not blow the opportunity on the governor's race side here if the Senate race is very winnable.
The Republican race for governors, the mainstream candidates, Brad Raffensperger, Chris Carr, they have not picked up steam in the polls. Raffensperger's always been around 15%. Carr's been kind of single digits. And these two MAGA warriors, these two MAGA loyalists, Rick Jackson, the newcomer who just upended the race a few weeks ago by getting in the race in a surprise move, going head to head with Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. We have not seen spending like this in a primary ever in Georgia history, at least in a midterm primary, where $100 million plus has already been spent just on TV ads alone. And it looks like they're neck and neck. I know a lot can change, but we've heard from Burt Jones saying, I expect to win it outright. That might just be hubris, right? And Rick Jackson's clearly playing for a runoff. He's already put a lot of money down for TV ads come Wednesday.
Yeah, look, none of the numbers I've seen suggest someone's close to 50% here in the preliminary. But with that kind of spending, we'll see if sometimes these primary days can bring a surprise. But it sure looks like Jackson and Jones. And then I think a really interesting question, if it does go to a runoff, and if it is reasonably close between them in the preliminary, if one doesn't have a giant lead over the other, what does Trump do in a runoff there? Having endorsed Jones, Jackson is someone who's sending very friendly signals Trump's way. Certainly, Trump's had some trouble in as wading into these Georgia primaries before. So is that endorsement of Jones? Is that something that just kind of sits there in the runoff and he takes more of the posture that we've seen him take in Texas, where it's more, hey, I kind of like both candidates, in that Senate race in Texas. I'll be happy to let the Republican voters decide. Or does he, is Jones his guy? And in a runoff, would Trump be willing to kind of fight for Jones now? I think that looms as an extra large variable in my mind, just out of what we saw Saturday night in Louisiana, where Bill Cassidy, opposed by Trump, couldn't even break a quarter of the vote in a Republican primary, where we just saw in Indiana, Trump wiped out these Republican state senators who had voted against him on congressional redistricting. His juice with the Republican primary electorate seems really strong right now. And so any of these, we talk about the Senate race too, I think, it makes him a pretty big X factor potentially.
Yeah, his endorsement in his first term was kind of a golden ticket. 2020, 2022, not so much in Georgia particularly. And then it feels like it's back. We'll see. His approval ratings among likely Republican primary voters in the last AJC poll just a few weeks ago was like 80% plus, 85%, not 90s, but certainly not 40s or 50s either. You mentioned the Georgia Republican Senate race, because the Trump endorsement is going to be huge in that too, if he does decide to take sides in a runoff. But right now, Kemp's legacy is on the line. Mike Collins, Buddy Carter, they're both battling it out as well. It's interesting because it's Derek Dooley who's really running with a different approach, with him and Governor Kemp saying, hey, look, I like the other guys, they're fine, but no one with a record can beat someone as formidable as Jon Ossoff. So we talked about electability on the Democratic governor side. Republicans are talking about it going up against someone as formidable as Jon Ossoff.
Yeah, no, look, clearly Dooley, just looking at the numbers, Dooley has the momentum on his side, coming at the expense, it looks like, of Buddy Carter there. So, looking at that again, I'm looking at Tuesday night with an eye towards the runoff is sort of how I'm going to be looking at the results here. My thought going in is that now, is that Collins still looks like he's in first year. That's my expectation. certainly looks like Dooley has moved into second and maybe moving up quickly. So it always open to a surprise with Carter. But if that's the dynamic, Collins versus Dooley, then I'm sort of looking again, like, how do these two land? How close can Dooley get to Collins heading into the runoff? And again, this question of Trump, kind of comes to my mind in the runoff there, because A, it's just like, look, can he resist getting involved because he likes to get involved in general? But B, I do wonder about the fact that Dooley, is Kemp's candidate. And I know on the surface, Trump and Kemp have sort of, patched things up here, I guess, a little bit. But there's that history there, and I'm sure that is the history that neither one of them has forgotten, especially Trump. And so if you've got a runoff there where you got Mike Collins, who's sort of, positioned himself as very sort of ardently pro-Trump, certainly that the Lake and Riley Act, which has been a centerpiece for Trump, versus Brian Kemp's candidate. Does that entice Trump at all is one thing I wonder.
Yeah, it's a good question. And one that I know, look, there's a lot of folks in Georgia and in the White House, all in the president's ear about this race, saying, trying to get him to sway things. And he hasn't so far, but he certainly could in that 4-week runoff. I want to ask you about early voting too, because, we've seen Democrats with the edge, and it's really unnerving Republicans. Republican analysts and candidates, they're out there on the airwaves, they're out there on social media saying, we're behind. How much do you actually read into that with the early voting numbers, and how careful should people be about over-interpreting what that could mean?
Well, I mean, it is the trend, that we've been seeing, is that Republican vote, and really the more pro-Trump side of the Republican vote, does come out disproportionately on Election Day. We just saw it. I said Saturday night we had this Louisiana Republican, Senate primary there, and you could see the splits in the early vote portion of it. Bill Cassidy, who was the candidate who Trump was trying to beat, did a lot better in the early voting portion of it than he did on the election day. So that's just inside the Republican Party. That pro-Trump side really did kind of weight more toward election day to come out. So you certainly do expect the gap to close a bit. But also those numbers that you're seeing in the early voting in Georgia are consistent broadly with what we're seeing across the country here. When I mentioned the Democratic energy in that nonpartisan Wisconsin State Supreme Court race, we're seeing this in a lot of primaries across the country here, where just the total turnout on the Republican side, total turnout on the Democratic side. The Democrats are doing a lot better than they were at this point, like in 2024. And that can signal energy. And it's not, when you're looking at a new poll out today, New York Times Siena poll nationally has Trump's approval rating dropping further, has the Democrats opening up an 11-point advantage nationally on the generic ballot. Some of these other results, that we've been seeing in the off-year elections last year in Virginia and New Jersey, I know those are blue states right now, but the Democrats dramatically overperformed, even when you accept the sort of blue state baseline there. So you're getting a lot of signals out there about, look, this is one of those midterms where you got a president who's not polling well. The Iran war seems to be a particular drag on him at the moment. And so starting to see a Democratic turnout advantage, which is suggested certainly by the early voting numbers in Georgia, that's consistent with a lot of other numbers that are out there.
It really is. As we're going into tonight, right, and we're starting to watch all the numbers come in. Is there a particular region? We mentioned DeKalb County earlier too, but a region or a part of Georgia that you're really going to intensely watch, like as a bellwether. I know Baldwin County is often the bellwether for Georgia for November elections, but primaries are different.
I always, Cherokee and Forsyth on the Republican side, I always go straight to those. Cherokee is still one of the largest Republican plurality producing in a general election, one of the largest in the country. The scale of the plurality there, I know it's receded a bit with time, but it's still a big one. So just those are two monsters in terms of the numbers statewide. So I always go straight to those for Republican primary.
Steve Kornacki, thank you so much for joining us. This is awesome.
Good luck tonight, Greg. Enjoy the show.
Thank you, sir. Well, that's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you enjoy what you heard, please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform and share Politically Georgia with a friend. Join us first thing tomorrow for a special Georgia primary edition of Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.